Hi, Rabbi Skolnik here. I'm delighted to have this opportunity to share some thoughts of Torah with you concerning Shabbat Parashat Vayakhel-Pekudei, and also coinciding with that, Shabbat Para. Vayakhel and Pekudei are the two concluding parshiot, or Torah portions, of the second of the 5 books of Moses, the book of Exodus, Sefer Shmot. And they afford us an opportunity to be provided with a painstaking reckoning that Moses made of all of the materials that were collected for the construction of the Mishkan, the portable sanctuary in the desert, and also a reckoning of how those materials that were collected were used and for what they were used. One of the timeless comments that the rabbis offer on Vayakhel and Pekudei, especially on Pekudei, is that they ask the question why it was that Moshe, of all the people, felt the need to provide a reckoning of how the materials that he collected were used. After all, the Torah says, B'chol beiti ne'emanhu, Moshe was the most trustworthy of all of the servants of God. He was humble, he was honest, he was self-effacing, he was so task-true and task-driven that it's almost inconceivable that he would have to provide some kind of an accounting for the work that he had done. But according to the Midrash, Moshe heard some of the people mumbling when they saw Moshe, to the effect that they thought that he was looking a little too prosperous. His thighs were too thick, his neck was too wide, and they assumed that he must be siphoning something off the top. He had collected all of that gold and that silver and that copper, and they thought that Moshe, being a person in the public trust, was simply doing what politicians do. He was skimming, and that the money that they were giving to the cause of the Mishkan was not all being used for the cause for which it had been donated. Moshe heard that murmuring, and he swore to himself that he would never allow the Israelites to accuse him of that kind of malfeasance, and therefore he did this painstaking reckoning, total transparency of everything that Moshe had collected, how it was used, and to what effect. So Moshe does this reckoning, and he provides the Israelites with all the information that they would need in order to believe in the honesty of his work. If you can, I encourage you to transpose this sensitivity, both in Moshe and in the Midrash's understanding of Moshe, onto contemporary political sensitivities, and try to imagine what a wonderful world it would be if every public elected official felt constrained to provide a totally open window, a clear window into how the public trust was being served and public monies were being spent, so as to be true to task. It's a lesson that we would all do well to be able to carry forward into this millennium and indeed this century, even though it's a story that's thousands of years old. The other thing that is significant about this particular Shabbat, as I mentioned earlier, is that it is Shabbat Para. That is the third of the 4 special Shabbatot preceding the festival of Passover. Shabbat Para, which always elicits a giggle from people who don't know what it is, literally means the Sabbath of the cow. And it's not just any cow that it's referring to, but it is a red heifer, the famous Para Aduma, whose ashes were used in a ceremony that was intended to purify, spiritually speaking, those people who had become impure by virtue of contact with the dead. The ashes were ashes of the sacrifice of this cow, which were then ground up and mixed together with water and certain spices, and they were sprinkled onto the person who was defiled as part of a purification ritual. There are, of course, a million questions to ask about this ritual, namely, why is it, what significance does it have, why a cow, why a red cow, why its ashes, why does it make someone pure who was impure, why does it render the priest who administers the ritual impure even as he's purifying those who were impure? There are so many questions, and it's tempting to try and give a rational explanation for all of this, but the truth is that the mitzvah of the para aduma, the commandment to use the ashes of the para aduma, serve for us as the paradigm of a chok. A chok is a category of Jewish law for which there's no apparent rational explanation. We do it because God says it. That's the nature of the command. And we recognize that even though we don't necessarily understand what we're being asked to do, nonetheless, God's bidding is enough to make us be obedient. The late Abraham Joshua Heschel, of blessed memory, once said that as Jews, we do more than we understand, so that ultimately we will understand more than we do. And I think that that's the sensitivity that is best applied here. Just in closing, the reason why we read of this ritual on this particular Shabbat as we draw closer to Passover is because the way that Passover was celebrated in the ancient world was in the sacrifice of the Paschal Lamb, the Korban Pesach, first in the sanctuary in the desert, later in the temple in Jerusalem. If you were ritually impure, you couldn't offer the sacrifice. You wouldn't be able to celebrate the festival in a timely fashion. So this was a public calling to those who were impure to rectify their status, undergo the purification ritual, and get themselves ready for the Passover holiday. To all of you, Shabbat Shalom.